Hey associates, so this video is just going to go over the revision process and sort of a quick kind of checklist to really try to focus on and complete for every document for this course, but also for any of your courses and your work projects. Anything like revision is always helpful, and that's because your first draft of any document or project or even idea is never going to be the best version of that document, project, or idea that it can be, right? The first is, that baseline. It gets you going, and then every time you return to it, you find tweaks and revisions and way to make it better. So, just remember, right, your first is never going to be your best. It's not bad. I'm not saying that your first is always going to be awful or some, incredibly rough draft, but just that your first version is never going to be the best version of that thing that it can be. So when it comes to revisions, focus on 3 key areas. First, you got to check the content, right? Because, if the content isn't there, then no matter what your document looks like or how you set it up, the audience is not going to be able to use it. Second, you need to check the organization. And so these 2 are important because you could have a document with all the right information and content, but it's so unorganized and difficult to read and navigate that users aren't going to be able to really actually apply it. Or you could have the most beautifully designed and organized document, but if it's lacking in information and content, then also that's not going to be a very productive, useful document either. And then lastly, you need to check just the little things, right? That's where you go through and see, how's the layout? How are the margins? What's the font looking like? Do I have grammatical errors? Do I need to proofread? Can I just switch up a few little things? So just 3 things to look at when you're doing your revisions: content, organization, and the little things. All right, so I can scooch me over a little bit here. Like I said, the first draft, it's just never the best draft. And I used to really live and die by this idea that, I'm a good writer. As an undergrad, obviously I was a good writer. I did fine, I was doing really well in all my classes, and so I really never took the outlining and drafting process to heart, and just pretty much always turned in my first draft. And again, they were good, good enough that my GPA was high and everything, but now that I've actually taken the time to truly go back to the work that I do and actually try to revise it and ensure that these elements are here, the quality is so much better, and it really doesn't take that much longer. It's just kind of returning to it for another hour or so and triple checking all these things. So the first one of sort of 4 very concrete action items I want you to do when you're revising, just test it out on some of these documents and see what happens and if they get better and how you feel about it, and you can tweak your process. But I recommend doing 4 things if nothing else. First, highlight your argument and your purpose statement, right, in this one, and really ask yourself, does this reflect the core of the document? And I mean physically go back and highlight this purpose statement, actually do it. Second, right, and so you make sure that everyone is there. When I'm grading, I will definitely be going through and looking specifically for your arguments and your purpose statements on your documents. Second, take an actual note of the topics and the subheadings and actually write these down on a little note card. Check, does the order make sense when you see it written out on a tiny piece of paper and you can kind of see all the topics and subtopics that you're going into. It's a little bit easier and faster to really see if the order makes sense compared to, trying to read through the whole paper. Third, read back over your roadmap in the introduction. That's in the first 10%. For technical writing especially, audiences, they want to know where we're headed and what you're going to tell us. So make sure that you have that good roadmap after your purpose statement, and then double check that you actually did the things that you outlined in the roadmap and that they correspond, and adjust your roadmap according to the content you ended up writing. And then last, write your summary or an abstract. Even if the document or the assignment or the audience doesn't need or require a summary or abstract, right? This is 200 words, so one tiny little paragraph. and try to do that on your documents no matter what. So it's a summary in 200-ish words or less. And this is, again, another way where you can really see if the organization and all the key points that you need and that you want, that they're there, they make sense, the order goes together. So those are 4 things, right, to kind of help you ensure that you're taking your reader on that journey, right, through your research, through your writing, through your document. Purpose statements, make sure your topics and subheadings are clear, we can navigate them. Ensure you have that roadmap and that it matches up with everything that you wrote. And then lastly, just go ahead and write yourself a summary or an abstract, just as another way to double check that the organization and the key points are being hit. All right. So when it comes to doing things like building up your background, right? So this is that literature review portion for that final paper, as well as your paper in progress. This is kind of what I'm looking for. So this is one area where a lot of these projects kind of go astray. And so make sure that you're building this and revising and looking for these kinds of things when it comes to your background section, right? So the background, you want to begin with more general information and then work your way up to that argument. Right, so you can imagine it like a staircase. And let's say we have our reader, we want to get them up here where ultimately your argument, jumps off of. And so you got to build them up to it, right? Now, in that first 10%, you are going to give them the argument and the purpose statement so they have an idea of what's at the top of the stairs. And then throughout the next, 4 to 5 pages of your lit review, that's where you're like building it up with the existing research and understanding. So for example, right, if we were doing, this is like a white paper, let's say, we're doing an empirical report for the proposal on if the CSU Stadium, has an impact on student life on campus, right? So the argument, questions for the purpose statement would be like, meaning that it has impacts on student life. And so this white paper explores the changes to student life since the construction of the stadium, or in the proposal format, it'd be something like, this proposal will explore if any changes have occurred to student life since the construction of the stadium, right? So then we start out with, okay, CSU history and context at the broadest. We want to place our reader in like, okay, we're on CSU campus and here's kind of what CSU is, what it looks like. Then the next step, now that we know where we're at geographically, is sort of more of that abstract like history of the topic itself, right? So here's like stadium history. So we know we're on CSU. We're now talking about this particular element of CSU and student life and all the things that went on there. And then we end the background and literature review with research and information about student life, like on a college campus and how it might interplay with football culture and sports culture, right? So we're just building them up, boop, boop, boop. And if you get a little bit lost, it can sometimes be helpful to, let's see if I can, yeah, I can. It can sometimes be helpful to look if you have a really strong purpose statement, right? And so it's like, okay, well, the CSU, right? CSU, right? And so you know where you need to start. The stadium. Oh, okay, well now I need to tell them about the stadium. And then lastly, you'll have your impacts on student life, right? Student life. So with a really strong kind of argument, research question, and purpose statement, it often will give you that really great roadmap to help you kind of build up that argument. Makes sense? All right, so then also double check your conclusions when you're revising. This is another place that kind of catches a lot of writers up. And so when technical and specialized writing, readers, they read the beginning, that first 10%, which is why you need to have a little bit of context. You need to have your purpose statement. You need to have the roadmap. And then often they'll kind of skim looking for the headings that they want, the information they like really, really want. And then they'll read the conclusion, that kind of last page. So make sure that your first page and your last page are really, really strong to kind of wrap everything up, tie it together with a nice bow, and make sure that your audience has the information you needed them to get. And so a good conclusion is going to restate some of those central points in the argument, right? So you're basically like re-summarizing like your roadmap from the introduction, but of course changing it. So instead of, you're going to discuss, it's like, okay, remember, you learn these things basically. And then also include some sort of, a call for action. So if you're doing, like a feasibility report, the call for action would be, okay, we have found that this thing is feasible. It's time to move forward in the next step of the process. And then you insert what that next step would be. It could also be a little bit more general of, there's some questions that still remain. Future research needs to look into, XYZ aspects. So try to think about, okay, what do you want your reader, your technical audience, to do with this information now? So it's going to turn that purpose statement into a nice call for action of, you got this information, here's what I want you to do with it and what we expect. Make sense? Cool. All right, so this was an example of a little conclusion that I did on a paper this semester. There we go. Okay, I had to go away for a sec. And basically, and these slides, I also will just post the slides so you can read it if you want. But my purpose statement here was, okay, so I trace how fandom culture has been institutionalized as a key component in the marketing technology for entertainment pop culture today. Okay, so that was my purpose statement. And my literature review kind of section, the front end of my paper, I explained the concept of fandom culture, sort of that nerd, geek, just the comic book fandoms in particular. I define sort of institutionalization in this context, so that way my audience, my critical cultural theory professor, knew that I knew what was going on. And then the rest of my paper talked about how fandom is like a marketing kind of thing for entertainment pop culture. So how YouTubers, I freaking love YouTubers and their content, and I love watching breakdowns and theory videos, and so really how that sort of fandom culture helps market and advertise films. And so my conclusion just summarizes like everything in that paper. So this was literally my very last paragraph of, it was a 16-page paper, and this was the final paragraph. And so the things I've underlined are really those core elements that, I was sort of just talking about, right? So in conclusion, starting with a nice, strong signpost. Listen, there's nothing wrong with a nice in conclusion. Audiences know what that means. They know it's the end. There's no need to necessarily get fancy. Yes, it's basic, but it's basic for a reason, and that's because everyone identifies with it and likes it and it works, right? So, in conclusion, and then I talk, here's my kind of general, most broad sort of summary that, hey, our entertainment evolves with new technology, right? That's like the biggest picture takeaway. And then I start narrowing down and reminding the audience of the key points from this paper that I really wanted them to take away, right? So the concept of influencing behavior, the way that production companies are encoding these special hints and Easter eggs, so fandoms can make theories about it and share it, and it goes viral. And then, ultimately, another sort of big picture call to action type of thing is that fandom marketing extends engagement time. We have way cooler products now, and we get to capture more attention, helps them stand apart, right? That's the big picture kind of implication of the work. And then I personally always end with some kind of silly, catchy thing that reflects the title of my paper. That's just a stylistic personal choice that I have the flexibility and freedom to do. You as a writer and in your own organizations kind of have to decide how that works out for you. So yeah, this is just an example of like a conclusion. The key points here, just make sure that you restate the big picture, like what do you want the reader to walk away from this paper knowing and doing? So that way, even if they skimmed through a whole bunch of the paper, they could read this one paragraph and be like, oh yeah, okay, no, I know what that was about and what I should do with it. When it comes to technical and professional and academic writing, there definitely is this kind of thing with first person. This depends on the audience a bit. Now, I am much more, I guess, progressive in the use of I. And so, I'm okay with it in there because I definitely, I think that writing I and yourself into your work doesn't necessarily make it less objective because you are the researcher. And so it's a bit of a fallacy to say, oh, the researcher says this, because we know who the researcher is. So in that case, I'm fine with using I. However, other professors, other employers, and people with maybe more traditional empirical backgrounds are going to shy away from that. So it's something to be aware of. So my kind of advice to walk that line is just to reserve first person statements for things that you really want and you need to own, and that you're like I did this and I need you as the reader to know that I did it. Because otherwise the problem is if you use a lot of it turns all of your work into something about you instead of about the data and the big picture and the point. So some examples where you might want to use first person language is things like I analyze the data, because you were the research tool analyzing the data potentially. Or if you're looking at things like case studies, or like in your literature review, potentially if you found some really interesting gaps that stood out, 2 things that stood out to me, right, based on the research, I recommend, as that call to action is really the place where you see I a lot. So just kind of, again, be aware. There's a very traditional stance that says none of it. I'm okay with it, but it needs to have impact. And if you're going to say I, you need to have a good reason for saying I in your work. And so the reason why you don't like I is because it often leads to lazy writing. And so that's what I'm going to be looking out for when I'm grading, right? So let's say you could so easily, and I see this a lot with writers, right? I believe that the campus stadium increases school spirit and student engagement. Okay, well, you didn't have to do any research on that. It doesn't point to the data. It literally is just an opinion statement, which just isn't going to get very far in technical writing. So by removing your ability to say I, it just forces the data to come to the forefront, right? So that same sentence without I is previous research on campus engagement suggests that stadiums increase the sense of community for students, right? So it's the same sentiment, but so much more impactful. There's way more. The data is front and center, right? You're now using previous research and letting the research speak rather than turning it into an opinion. So that's kind of the big reason why technical and academic writing doesn't like I, because often it just turns into this sort of okay, cool, instead of a strong research-driven statement. A little bit of a window and a look into the revision process and some ways that you can definitely make your documents and your projects and your work just higher quality, get to that A level. So just make sure again that you're checking the content. Go back to the assignment memos. Make sure you have those minimum required elements in there. Make sure that you met the objectives and then you we're practicing the skills outlined, and those are going to be the best ways to check that your content is in the right place. Check your organization, right? Make sure that I can find all the information, you as your primary audience, but think about, what kind of technical audiences might need. Do that with good headings and bullet points if necessary, tables, figures, the font size, spacing, white space, all the document design elements, organization, topic sentences, roadmaps. All of that is going to help the reader sort of work through your document. Lastly, go back, check all the little things, get those fine-tuning, those little details, download Grammarly so it can help you with just the basic proofreading. And with those kind of 3 things, the revision process should go pretty quickly, but is going to, have a much higher return on investment than just sort of aimlessly reading through your document. Actually have some action steps to check and see. All right, I look forward to all of your assignments and work. Bye, associates.